As we noted, we try to do a cross-section of local history. We try to cover everything from early history of Chautauqua County to some of the more newer items, historically speaking, here in the county. And this is one of the newer ones that happened in many of your lifetimes, happened in the 1930s and 40s, as a matter of fact. I think it's going to be a great presentation, and I'm really excited to hear about it. I knew a little bit about the POW camps before starting on this project, but I had no idea there was just so many of them throughout Chautauqua County, all the way from the Silver Creek area all the way down to Ripley, along the lakeshore especially. And anybody from Jamestown here? Jamestown? You may remember that there was a tornado that came through Brooklyn Square in Jamestown. This is how I first learned about the POW camps. 1945, right, Norman? What date?
June 10th, 1945.
And what time, Norman? There was a tornado that came through, and that's how I first learned about the POW camps, was that they actually brought a lot of the prisoners from Dunkirk down to help the cleanup effort in the Jamestown area. And that's when I first learned about that a few years ago. But of course, that is just one small tidbit of information about the POW camps, not only here in Chautauqua County, but throughout the entire Western New York and United States area, where these laborers came in. They were prisoners, and they were treated very well, according to what a lot of people say, considering they were prisoners of war, and we were fighting against them in that war. But enough about that. Of course, I only know a very small amount of the details. We do have a gentleman here who is a teacher at Dunkirk High School, Dunkirk Middle School. He's sort of been keeping up with this project for several years now. He even had his students involved, which is great to get the younger generation involved in local history. And so I'm very excited to hear what he has to say, and I'm sure you all are as well. So at this point, I'll stop talking and let him begin. Put your hands together and please welcome Ryan Corbett, today's speaker.
As Jason stated, I was part of a group of teachers in Chautauqua County who were asked to join this organization called TAH. The TAH stands for Teaching American History. Two gentlemen in the Jamestown area, Rick Walters and Paul Benson, wrote a grant and received an enormous amount of cash to start this program to try and get social studies teachers in Chautauqua County to teach a little bit more about local history. So in joining this and going through a 2-week workshop in the summer, they are going. Before I get started, just a little bit about me. Like I said, I was born and raised in Dunkirk. Became a teacher. This will be my 20th year at the Dunkirk Middle School this upcoming school year. And just have always loved this area and everything this area has to offer. All the way, I mean, between fishing and hunting, you know, all the way up into Westfield area and that. I never had the need to leave, say. And to be able to save a little bit of the history of this area is something that I'm kind of proud of, and hopefully you'll all enjoy what I have to offer tonight. Before I get started, though, I would like to do a little politicking myself. I am a board member at the Dunkirk Historical Society. There are things going on. If you have nothing to do this weekend, the Dunkirk Historical Society and the Dunkirk Historical Lighthouse have teamed up to put on a Civil War reenactment down at the lighthouse. It will be the 17th and the 18th. And the public is welcome to come in and witness what is going on there. The Civil War reenactor is actually a cousin of mine, and I talked to her the other day and I said, you know, how are things going? And she said, this is really getting bigger than I thought it was going to be. Kind of like tonight, maybe. So it should be a very, very interesting thing. Come on down, enjoy yourself, and take on a little bit of the Civil War history that they put on there. The other thing that we're doing, and I would like Skeeter Tower to please, I don't know where you went. There you went. Okay, you were over there. Stand up. We're doing a house tour of Dunkirk, and she's the one who is heading that, so I would like her to give you a little information on that. Information on this POW camp. First misconception that I had about this was that Dunkirk, being the city, we had the prisoner of war camp. Didn't even know one existed in Brockton. Didn't even know one existed in Westfield. at the time. I just figured we were the city, we had the camp. The kids went to the library, and these 5 students spent 5 hours in the Dunkirk library going through any books that they could find, going through newspapers that were there, microfilm, microfiche, and they found this article right here. 5 hours. And the article was, "War prisoners may spend winter here." This was actually from 1944, as they were closing the camp up, getting ready to close the camp up, and they were going to keep the prisoners in Dunkirk one more winter so that they could remove snow if we had a bad winter. 5 hours. 5 8th grade students. Let me say that again. 5 8th grade students spent in the library, and this is all they came up with. This was it. So I thought, this might be a little bit more difficult than I thought. Let's go to the historical societies and see what they have. So we went to the Dunkirk Historical Society first, because at this time, I believe Dunkirk was the only one that had a prisoner of war camp. And we found these newspapers, which became basically our foundation. It was when they opened up the Dunkirk camp in June of 1944, and they gave a little tour, and this was the information that they had come up with on this. It basically talked about what the prisoners were doing there, what their meals were, how many calories they were getting, their general care and health care that was provided to them, and things of that nature, where they were going to work and the types of services that they would provide for the area while our boys were overseas fighting. Was better, but still wasn't a whole heck of a lot. The other thing that we found was from 1982, where somebody had probably the same idea I had, and went back and found some of the gentlemen who had worked in the Dunkirk camp, met some of the lovely ladies in Dunkirk and married them at that time, and then settled there. And so there was about 4 or 5 gentlemen who had worked as guards at the Dunkirk camp, and they kind of interviewed them and had done their stories. Still not what I was looking for. Still not information about, how the camp started and stuff like that. And continuing, we ran across a few other things. The Nazis next door. And in going through all this, this was mostly about Fort Niagara. There was one little section on Dunkirk in there. I found this small, soft-covered book, 25, 30 pages, and this upper paragraph here is the only mention of the Dunkirk camp at all. So very little information to go on with all of this. That's when we reached out and went a little further. I told the kids, I said, we just don't have enough to make anything here. There's not enough. So we decided to make a help wanted ad. We were going to put it in the Dunkirk Observer. Help wanted, anybody with any information about the POW camp in Dunkirk, please contact me. I left my phone number in there. And we took this help wanted thing down to the Observer, and the Observer says, we'll do a story on you. And in February of 2007, this was the story that they did on us. It was done on a Sunday paper. My phone started ringing about 8:30 in the morning, and the battery went dead. I was on the phone all day long. I probably talked to 50 people who had recollections about the camp and working with prisoners wherever they had worked during the war and whatnot. So we sat down with the kids again and said, okay, how about if we do this? How about if we contact these people asked them for permission to sit down and collect their oral histories, videotape them, and instead of doing a documentary on the POW camp, since we don't have any information on the POW camp, we will do a documentary on these people's oral histories. And the kids were very excited about it, and that's the route we ended up going. To this day, I'm still trying to find out more information about the camps. I have contacted the military. I have contacted the National Archives. I have collected this. This is the only thing that the National Archives had on record. It's work order. It's every day whoever was in charge, they had to count the prisoners, make sure everyone was there, how many were going out to work, how many were on sick call. So this is kind of like the daily attendance of the prisoner of war camp. But this is still all that I've been able to collect other than the oral histories. And after doing this, I think it worked out better. One of the people that I spoke to had informed me, because we had one picture about Italians being at the prisoner of war camp. And for the life of me, I couldn't figure it out. I'm like, this was Germans. I know it was Germans. Where are the Italians coming from? And that's when we discovered that Brockton had the first prisoner of war camp. Mine's on too. I better shut that off too. Brockton actually had the first prisoner of war camp, and one of the people that were hired at this prisoner of war camp was a young lady who had just finished high school and could speak Italian. And she happens to be with us tonight, and that is Miss Mary Trippi right here in the middle of the room. She was an interpreter at the Brockton camp, and in speaking to her, we figured out that, yes, Brockton had a camp, and then talking to other people, Westfield had a camp, and Dunkirk was actually one of the last, that was the last camp that was built in the area. So that was a misconception that we started with that was fixed throughout all of this. Another misconception that we had was, in growing up in Dunkirk, I always noticed that the fairgrounds had a fence with barbed wire on it. I said, well, that's obviously because they put the prisoners there. And another gentleman that I talked to cleared up that misconception for me, and he said, no, that barbed wire was actually put up during the Great Depression, because people like me and my brother used to try and sneak in the fence, and the one day my brother ripped his hand open on that barbed wire. We didn't have the dime to get into the fair, so we would try and sneak in. So during the Great Depression is when the barbed wire actually went up, and I learned, and you can see in some of the pictures that I have up here, that there was another fence built inside of that fence with the prison towers put and on the corners, the guard towers, I should say, put on the corners so that armed guards could stand over them. Not that they were necessary. It seemed like throughout this I figured Germans, Nazis, bad people. World War II enemies. These prisoners couldn't have been liked. Total misconception. Total misconception. I could not believe the stories that I was getting from people about how nice these prisoners were and how great it was to have them here, and they were so happy that being here. The one gentleman actually, and you'll hear it in the video, talked about a gentleman who was working on the farm, and he just wanted to ride this tractor so badly. So they said, okay, you can drive the tractor today. And he's like, yeah, I have one of these. I'm like, back in Germany? He's like, no, I'm from Iowa. He goes, when the war started, my family was involved. I went back to Germany and got drafted in to fight for for the German army. And then I got captured and I got sent home. And I guess what, as I said, the misconception that I had with all of this was that this was the enemy. These were, the hated. Hitler and the SS and just terrible, terrible people. And many of the people, like I said, you'll see in the video, understood that they had a duty to their country just as our boys had a duty to our country, and many of these prisoners were extremely happy to have been captured and brought here, because what was going on over there as we were pushing the Germans back into Germany, it wasn't very pretty for them at all. And they were much happier to be here than in Russia, because Russia didn't take prisoners of war. And I actually had talked to a gentleman who runs the World War II Museum just south of Olean in Eldridge, and he actually told us a story at one of the workshops I was at of an uncle of his who was a bodyguard for Hitler and had been captured by the Russians, and they were being walked across this bridge, and he was noticing that all of the gentlemen who had the SS insignia, they weren't going very far. They'd get to the other side of the bridge and they were being shot in the head, dead, right there. This gentleman ripped off his badges without anybody seeing them, and he ended up surviving in a prisoner of war camp for a numerous amount of years. And when the Russians finally let them go, they said, "You're free to go." He's like, Go? And they're like, "Yeah." And it took him 2 years to walk from Russia back home to Germany where he lived. So the prisoners that were here were treated very well. We followed the Geneva Accords as we were supposed to, and they were very happy to be here and actually kind of enjoyed it from what you'll see in some of the things. I was able to speak to one gentleman, Frank Lisa, who is from Dunkirk and still lives in Dunkirk. He was one of the gentlemen in this Do You Remember photo that was in the Observer. He's the little guy up here on his shoulders. He was the medic at Dunkirk, and he's still alive and was able to give me his story and talk about some of the things, and you'll see him in the video. But he is the only one out of all the gentlemen that worked there and had done the article in '82 that was still alive. So I missed my opportunity probably by a couple years to gather maybe some of the more in-depth information that I had hoped to gather about the prisoner of war camp. Just one more thing before I show you the video, because it is still my goal to find some prisoners in Germany, some people in Germany who were prisoners in this area. This gentleman was actually a prisoner here in Dunkirk and had come back to Dunkirk. He had come back to the United States. There were quite a few German prisoners of war who did come back after they were sent back to Germany. They got their stuff together and just came right back here and moved to the United States, because there was prisoners of war camp throughout the whole United States. That was one of the big things that the Allies not were only happy about getting our fresh troops and our fresh equipment and so forth, but now they had some place to dump the prisoners of war that were really wearing on their countries, because they just had no place to put them. So many of these prisoners did come back to the United States. This one was a prisoner in Dunkirk, and he came back and visited. When he was here, he left all his itinerary of when he was left, his ID card they photocopied, and so forth. Unfortunately, when I was doing the project, his address and phone number, I believe he had been deceased by the time that I did this. I got a return to sender, so I have no first-hand information of any prisoners that were here. But I have another student who came by a couple years later who was stationed in Germany, and as we speak, he is feverishly trying to find me some prisoners of war that were in this area. That was his job. I said, "You might be in the military and have to answer to Uncle Sam, but you have to answer to Mr. Corbett still, too. Find me a prisoner." So I'm hoping that at some point I will get some information in that area and so forth. So that's basically where we ended up, and like I said, the oral histories that we were able to collect, we turned into a 45-minute video. So please sit back, enjoy, and see what my kids and I created in 2007.
When the United States entered World War II, it meant a great many things to the Allies. One of the little-known benefits was that it created another place to send prisoners during the war. Western New York would be one of the places prisoners would be housed at during the war. For those that lived in Western New York at the time, the benefit was neutral. During the war, there was a need for workers in the various canning factories, greenhouses, and meat production plants. Labor was also needed from the many local farms, and the POWs would be used to fulfill that need. In Chautauqua County, there would be 3 known camps: Westfield, Brockton, and Dunkirk.
The Westfield camp, which is surrounded by Nicholas Avenue, Bird Street, Bourne Street, and Lake Street, was organized by what was known as the Westfield Food Commandos. Manpower at harvest time was a concern many local farmers and food processors shared during World War II. The Food Commandos helped solve this problem by building a prisoner of war camp in Westfield. The village of Westfield seemed to have a strict set of rules for its residents to follow pertaining to the camp. Civilians were not allowed in or near the POW camp. Although the prisoners would come in contact with people while they were working, civilians were not allowed to fraternize with the prisoners. Guards were in charge of all prisoners, and civilians must not interfere with the work of the guards in any way. These rules were printed in the newspaper and seemed to be followed by the locals. This is a possible reason we experience a difficult time uncovering information about this camp.
My name is Ralph Wakely. I'm from Westfield, New York, and today we're talking about the German POWs that were stationed in Westfield. And at this time, I can't tell you too much about the camp itself, but I worked with 2 brothers on Route 5, farmers, Cochran brothers, and the one had Frederick Cochran and William Cochran, and they were brothers. And during the fall season, I believe it was in late 43 or 40.
I think it.
And you used to have different ones that they would lease out to the farms that they didn't have the guards. And Fred Cochran, he'd go in, he'd pick up 5 every day to help during harvest time.
They were called trustees, right?
They were trustees, right? And we were doing cutting corn for silo and everything. And I recall the one fellow that we had at the farm, we had this farm-all tractor. And I was driving that, and the wagon was backing in, and we had the German guys loading the wagon, and I had one brother, he would work on the wagon, and they handed it on to him, and he'd load that. Well, anyway, this one German fella, he come along, he jumped on the drawbar, you know. He leaned over and he says to me, he says, "These are nice little tractors, aren't they?" And I said, "Well, I said, this is the second one they've had." I said, "Well, I like them." And he says, he says, before the war, he said, "I worked out west where these were made." And I said, "Really?" And he said, of course, he talked real good English. And he said, "Yes." He said, "Y'all didn't like it, what state it was that these farmers were made." And he says, I said, "Gee whiz," I said, "would you like to drive it?" And he said, "Would you let me drive this?" He said, "Sure." He felt like a little kid. He got back of that and he drove around. I said, "On the drawbar," and I said, "Well, by the way," I said, "what are you going to do?" He said, he said, when the war broke out, of course, he said, I had to go back to Germany. He said, "Go there." And I said, "What are you going to do in the war?" "Oh," he said, "I'm coming back." He says, "I'm coming back." Germany, no place for me.
Located on Lake Road, where the current fire hall stands and the high school once stood, Brockton had what is believed to be the first prisoner of war camp in Chautauqua County. Erected sometime in 1943, the Brockton camp housed both Italian and German prisoners of war.
I'm Ed Sunday. I live 8693 Bear Lake Road in Brockton. And I just have a vivid memory of when the German and Italian were prisoners in Brockton. And they were housed in the old Brockton High School, which had been empty for several years since they'd opened the Brockton Central School. The location was on Lake Avenue in Brockton.
I'm Mary Trippy from Brockton.
We got up there.
On June 26, 1944, the Chautauqua County Fairgrounds, located in Dunkirk, became home to over 450 German prisoners of war. The prisoners were housed on the grounds in many of the existing buildings.
During the period of World War II, I lived on Central Avenue, living in 1062 and 1068 Central Avenue. They are located on Central Avenue on the opposite side of the street of the fairground where the power lines now go across. We had 3 greenhouses at that time until 1966, at which time Niagara Mohawk took our property. The prisoners during World War II, for a time, were stationed at the fairgrounds in Dunkirk. The barbed wire fence was not installed at that time. The barbed wire fence was installed many years previous to World War II. As a young boy living across the street, many people, including myself, would try to sneak into the fairground, and by having that barbed wire, it stopped the youth from getting into the fairground. And I'm talking people 10 years old in them days had to pay to enter the fair.
My name is Frank Lisa, and I was a soldier at the Dunkirk Fairgrounds where it was a German prisoner of war camp. And my job up there was a medic to take care of both enlisted men and the prisoners of war. The camp, located on Central Avenue in Dunkirk, had approximately 400 prisoners, 40 enlisted men. Prisoners had use of the old barns from the fairgrounds when they had county fairs and so forth, and these were changed to become barracks for them. They had their kitchen, their mess hall, and their sleeping quarters all enclosed in this compound.
The German prisoners were treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention by the guards. There were several reasons for this. First, it was not the American way to substitute revenge for justice. Second, the Army was, and still is, governed in its treatment of prisoners by the law of the land, of which the Geneva Convention is a part. And third, these men were there to work. At the time, American farmers and processors were paying the going rate for American labor of the same kind, and they would not have received much of a return for their money from undernourished prisoners. Therefore, the prisoners were fed some 3,460 calories a day if they were working, and 2,500 if they were not. Meals included, for breakfast, oatmeal, raisin rolls, tea, bread, and margarine. For dinner, stew, bread, and water. Work details would get a cold-cut sandwich and drink. For supper, noodle soup, carrots and milk, tea, and bread. Healthcare was also provided to the prisoners by an Army medic.
I had a call each morning for anyone that was sick or injured. I'd check them out, see what I could do for them, and in general, look to their health. If the problem was too serious, we had an Army ambulance that would take them up to Fort Niagara, where the military doctors stationed. Our routine was fairly simple. It was the men were assigned, the prisoners were assigned to various duties throughout the county, on farms, factories, some included the old Lee Root meat processing plant, Red Wing in Fredonia, and some that I can no longer recall. But the prisoners themselves, we had no complaints. They were treated fairly by those that they were employed by, and they were treated well by the Army personnel.
We had a lot of people come along, and while we were there giving them candy bars and talking, the people would come along and talk to them also. Like one time maybe there was 8 or 9 people there beside us. And the prisoners enjoyed it because they were away from home, homesick. They didn't know what was happening and all. And we were glad we could give them a laugh or two, you know. The very fact that the guards would not let us buy anything that was in a package. Packages of gum were okay, and candy bars, and small bags of potato chips, but they wouldn't let us give them anything that was in a container because I guess they were afraid they were going to have weapons in them or something. They were getting good food, good treatment, and like I said, the guards were there. They wouldn't let us talk to them alone. They were all around there. I think there were 5 or 6 guards that we got to know, and they knew we weren't going to do them any harm. I mean, like poison the food or anything like that. But we just put ourselves in their place, that they had been fighting for their country.
Hello, I'm Richard Agel. I can remember the German prisoners. We had them on our farm. I'm from Collins, New York. We live on Route 39. I still live on the same farm, and my son is farming on the farm where the German prisoners worked. At noontime, they brought their lunch, and I remember it was a wooden box about so long and about so wide, and it had a slide door on the top of it, and they'd have their sandwiches in there, and maybe a gallon of cold coffee or cold juices or a Kool-Aid. And then what they really appreciated, my mother and my grandmother and my aunt would, every noon, would fix them a hot dish, like maybe scalloped potatoes or macaroni and cheese, or maybe give them a pie or cake or something like that. And boy, they really liked that for lunch. And then about 4 o'clock, 3:30, 4 o'clock, we'd have to get them ready. So we'd have them back here to Dunkirk at, I don't know what time, but it was for supper time. And then the next morning, my dad would pick them up again.
My name is Walt Pasden, and I live in Silver Creek. They had a good life. They had good meals, and they certainly didn't have to work hard, any harder than what we did. And of course, we were only 16 years old. And most of the fellas were, I would say, in their 20s. There were some that were 30s and 40-year-olds.
As stated earlier, the prisoners were brought to this area to fill in for the labor shortage that the United States experienced during World War II. The prisoners worked at the American Grape Juice Company, Red Wing Company, Sally Brothers Greenhouses,
Lee Root's Slaughterhouse, Bedford Products, Spotto's Canning Factory, Salsina Canning Factory, and the Jervis Canning Factory, to name a few. They also labored on many of the local farms. It was believed that in 1945, the POWs laboring in Chautauqua County made the American government over $2 million. For their work, the POWs got 80 cents a day. This was given to them in form of currency usable at their canteen. The prisoners' day began around 5 a.m. with breakfast at 6 a.m. Work details would leave the camp at 7 a.m. and return as late as 7 p.m. depending on the type of work they were doing.
My name is Robert Manzella. I was born and raised in Dunkirk. And I was 8 years old at the end of the World War II. And so I do have recollections of the German POWs who were housed at the fairgrounds. They came here to work in the canning factories and work on the farms. I think they did probably some public works projects. I really don't remember everything that they did, but I do know that we would see them working, particularly in the canning factories and in the greenhouses and in agricultural related jobs.
During World War II, the fair ceased to be. There was no fair activity at all. And at some point, and I'm not sure exactly when, the prisoners came there. A good friend of mine, Robert Daly, was employed at that time as a young man. I remember in them days, people 14 years old and even younger worked. And so he met many of these prisoners, but how many, I do not know. It's unfortunate that he has passed away, or I'm sure he would be able to recall. They worked at Sally Brothers, and I just assumed they worked on other agricultural farms. Sally Brothers, which is no more, was located on Newton Street in Fredonia. Sally Brothers was the largest Western New York greenhouse operation in the area of Western New York. How many people they employed altogether, I have no idea. But it was a real large operation.
I moved into the Silver Creek area from Buffalo in 1941, at which time I was probably 14 or 15 years old. And of course we were engaged in the Second World War, and I had just finished high school. So because it was a war effort, we all had to do whatever we could. And being 16 years of age, they had us working in the canning factory, and that was in Forestville. And when we were working there, we had the prisoners working right along with us. And they were doing as much work and working at any jobs that any of the school kids were doing. And this one evening, when we got through working, the foreman at the canning factory came up and says, "Walt, you're going to have to drive the prisoners back to the barracks today." And I says, "I don't even know where the barracks are, because being that I moved here from Buffalo, I had no idea where the fairgrounds were. And I was here on Central Avenue in Dunkirk." So the foreman says, "Well, one of the prisoners will ride with you in the cab of the truck. The other one's right in the back, and he'll correct you as where to go." Now that put me in a very serious situation, because here it was all new to me, and I said, "Well, I don't know these prisoners that well, or what they could do or what they would do," because I had just started working in the canning factory. But we got along quite well, and they told me where to go, where to turn, and everything worked out all right.
Prisoners were used as laborers at the Welch Grape Juice Company and Spoto Canning Company, and also on the farms. When they worked at Welch's and Spoto's, they were marched up to the plants by the guards, and They were housed, as I said, at the high school. I'm not sure what hours that they did work, but I think maybe it was from 7 to 5 or something like that.
We transported them to our Rockton Preserving Company, which was a canning factory owned by Carl Spoto, and he processed green beans and tomatoes, ketchup, and the Welch plant. Of course, we had the grapes up there, and they were very, very helpful there. In fact, Welch has bought what they called a gorilla, which was a new pressing machine, and we got this because we heard so much about it from the Italian war prisoners.
As I can remember, at that time I was about 10 or 11 years old, and my father would get up at like 4 or 4:30 to be over here to Dunkirk to pick up the prisoners, and we had to take 10 of them, as I can remember, and every 10 they would be one guard that would go with them, and it would be a soldier. He had an army uniform on with a rifle, and how we'd pick them up, we had a Chevy pickup with a rack on the side and put a canvas over the top and benches in the back, and then the guard would ride in the front with my dad, and the prisoners would ride in the back, and well, they'd start working about 7 o'clock in the morning. We were supposed to keep all 10 of them together so the guard could watch them, but we had, after the summer went along, we kept sorting them out and we had a real good bunch. We could take the ones we wanted, and the ones that didn't want to work too much, we'd leave them back and take another one in exchange. And after we got all 10 of them were real good workers and wanted to work on the farm, then we sort of would let them work on, I remember our barn burned in 44, and we had them in 45, because that's when we built the barn, and a couple of them were pretty good carpenters, and they would work putting on siding and different things. Had an oat field, and at that time they didn't have combines. They would just shock the oats in the field, and we'd have to let them dry, and then when it got time to thrash them, we had to go out in the field with a wagon and take pitchforks and load them on the wagon, and there'd be a couple guys on the wagon and a couple of them, 3, 4 on the ground, pitching them up into the wagon. And I remember I was driving the tractor, pulling the wagon along the field, and we were coming down through the field with a load of oats on, and we blew a tire out. And one of the German prisoners, he got off of the tractor and he went down, he grabbed a bunch of the stubble down here, and he kept putting his hand on top of them, and he tried to make us he thought the stubbles is what blowed the tire. And my uncle said, no, it wasn't that, it was just the tire was old.
My name is Harold Snyder. I was born in 1930, which makes me 77 years old. And in 1945, we had prisoners, POWs, at the fairgrounds in Dunkirk. They were used locally as labor, and as a young man of 14, I joined them at one point picking up potatoes about a mile from here. Another thing I can recall, the rest of the conversation, especially about POWs in the area, was almost nil. Nobody ever talked about them, but they came and did their work, and they worked well. And what I did with them was pick up potatoes out of the field where the potatoes were already dug, and we were just picking them up and putting them in baskets. But they worked also on farms, cannon factories. We had a P-1 here in operation at that time. They also worked there. But mainly, is all they did was laborers' work.
From what we were able to learn, there did not seem to be any animosity towards the prisoners, even though they were the enemy. For the most part, the prisoners were liked by those who came into contact with them. Those that did not have any direct contact with those prisoners did not seem to be affected either way by them being in the area.
The feeling of people about the camp being there, I think it's just something they got used to. I think they simply accepted it. There may have been a few on one side and a few on the others that had stronger feelings, but in general it was accepted. My feeling about the camp being there, I thought it was a good thing. I assumed that better have them in the camp and have them shooting at you. So.
We were just kids. We'd go mow a lawn or something and get some money, get paid for it, go to the Murphy store up in Fredonia and buy some candy bars, and sometimes they wanted shaving cream and stuff like that, but we would just talk to the prisoners, and we felt sorry for them, even though they were so-called the enemy. They were only doing their job for their country, so it wasn't all that bad. They were interesting. They were very interesting. They spoke, some of them spoke broken English and some of them spoke German, and I was lost, although my grandfather came to this country from Germany.
Of course, we were short in conversation, but I couldn't help but know that they were very polite, very clean, and very courteous, which at that time, as a young man, impressed me. And I think one of the funniest things, as I can recall, the local elders were quite concerned because the young ladies were fraternizing with them, mainly through the fence in Dunkirk at the fairgrounds. And I have since wondered just what were they afraid of? I mean, what could they do other than talk? And I guess they were passing food stuff to them through the fence, which they didn't like at all, but I guess I might say that as a young man, I could see no reason for concern.
When I was working there at the factory, I was what they called a cook. We had these large vats, iron vats, and the prisoners would bring these cans of beans off the conveyor into these iron baskets. And it was my job to bring these containers, and there was usually 3 of them set in a vat, and that we would use not a pulley, but a lifting device, and we lower these vats we lower the kettles into the vats. And there's one time the prisoner was watching me, and of course I was looking at what I was doing, but one of these vats fell off the cart. Now this would be a vat that would be maybe 3 feet wide and 2 feet high, full of cans, full of beans. And this prisoner ran up there and he grabbed this, and it was hard for me to believe that he had that much strength, but the adrenaline worked to the point where he did that, and all these years I had never forgotten. But they were really good guys to work with.
My name is Lorraine. Corvetta Madursky. I live in Dunkirk, and I can recall the prisoners at the fairgrounds on Central Avenue in Dunkirk. But at the time, I lived in Forestville. I was raised in Forestville, went to school in Forestville, and I can recall the prisoners would come to the canning factory. I can recall they had a guard, but they didn't need a guard. Each and every one of these prisoners was very, very friendly. They had great respect for us, and we often liked to talk to them. And then there was times we had a corner grocery store, we'd ask the guard if we could take them for ice cream. And one time in particular, we asked them if they liked war. And they said no, and they got their guns. They had to go just as much as the American soldiers had to go. They had to fight. They didn't like it. And they weren't too happy about going back. They liked the prison camp where they were. They were treated with great respect, and there was never any complaints from them. I can recall one thing in particular, and it'll never ever leave me, and that was at the time when they had to go back and leave prison camp. And we asked them if they knew any songs, and we used to sing all kinds of songs to them, and they told us they knew one song in particular that they wanted to sing to us, and that was our Wiedersehen. And it was very sad. We hated to see him go, but we knew they had to go. And so many times I was thinking about him, wondering about it, and then when I seen this in the paper, I wondered how many ever came back to the United States, how many ever came back to Dunkirk.
All three camps seem to be built from the same floor plans. Barbed wire fencing with elevated guard sheds were placed at each corner, and floodlights were used during the nights. Each camp had an area for recreation. The prisoners would partake in sports such as volleyball, badminton, and their favorite, soccer.
These prisoners were enclosed in a compound, barbed wire compound, with floodlights and machine gun towers on all four corners. Though we had no problems in that line with the prisoners.
At the fairground itself, there were towers, I'm saying about 8 to 10 feet high, and there would be one guard with a gun up in these towers so that no one could escape. I doubt that anyone ever even attempted at all to escape. And the one thing that I noticed all the years that they were there, which I believe was only 2, is that they played with a ball, which I find today was soccer. I had no idea what the game was at all at that time. For in America, soccer was unknown.